Sawadee-ka, greetings and good afternoon from Bangkok. Welcome to the Equitable Education Alliance webinar with the special theme of today is Exercising Equity to Deliver an Inclusive Classroom. This webinar is organized by the Equitable Education Alliance or EEA. My name is Piyapa, Knowledge Management Manager of the Southeast Asian Minister of Education Organization Secretariat or Senior Secretariat. And it is my honor to be the facilitator for this session. And for the Thai participants who prefer to listen in Thai language, please click the Thai interpretation channel or watch the live session on EEF Thailand Facebook page. สำหรับผู้ที่เข้าร่วมประชุมจากประเทศไทยนะคะท่านสามารถเลือกช่องแปลภาษาไทยหรือเข้าร่วมฟังเว็บบินาร์เป็นภาษาไทยจากทาง Facebook ของ EEF Thailand ค่ะ And this session is a part of the 6th EEA meeting that we aim to highlight one of the main areas of expertise known as delivery and implementation systems. You will be learning from our two distinguished speakers on evidence-based school and classroom practices and introduction of process-oriented child monitoring into the Vietnamese early childcare education system. And thank you to all participants who are joining us in Zoom and Facebook channel. Special appreciations go to our honorable speakers who will share their expertise and experience today. And I hope that our audience will learn a lot from their presentations. And without further ado, may I invite Dr. Supakon Bosai, the advisor of the EEA Secretariat, for the opening message. Dr. Supakon is the former Managing Director of the Equitable Education Fund of the EEF Thailand. Dr. Supakon, the floor is yours.
In Bangkok, I would like to say good afternoon, but for some of you, it's good evening, good morning, good midnight, good whatever, according to your time, to your time frame, your time zone. Good day for all the distinguished guests and friends who are here with us through our different channels. Welcome to the 6th meeting of the Equitable Education Alliance, or EEA, under the topics of exercising equity to deliver an inclusive classroom. Before going to our two guest speakers, I would like to steal a bit of your time introducing the EEA. In fact, I am welcoming you on behalf of Dr. Grayot, who is the current Equitable Education Fund, or EEF. He is now probably on the plane. He was just visiting the University of Chicago, discussing possible collaborations with Professor Heckman. Some of you may know that Professor Heckman won the Nobel Prize in Early Childhood, which is the key group, one of the key groups in education. Hopefully, we will soon launch a longitudinal studies on the Thai early childhood. And in a few years' time, I hope we will come back and share something with you about this cohort study. Thanks to the initiatives of the UNESCO, that the Equitable new slide. Thanks to the initiative by UNESCO that the Equitable Education Alliance, or EEA, is forming. Actually, we are moving to the 2nd year. The EEA is communities of practitioners from organizations, government ministries, agencies, and NGOs. These people strive to push for a more inclusive and equitable educational system. We aim at enhancing the performance of existing equitable education organizations at all levels. So we are working with you guys, organizations, both from the operational, from the classroom up to the policy level. Next slide, please. Like many of you today, I am myself a newcomer to the EEA. That's because we are just less than 2 years old, just a toddler alliance. In fact, I switched to education about the latter half of my life. I married to an educator family. So you can imagine it's quite embarrassing because all of them are all teachers. And for until then, I had always feared teachers all my life. It was my wife who successfully changed my coat color to education reform. Then ongoing work on education reform for Thailand. So I had played some role in establishing the Thailand Equitable Education Fund, and we started the legislations in 2018. I think, I guess, the UNESCO started the EEA, this alliance in Thailand, because the country had featured some improvements, although we don't have a better education system like other countries, but we show some improvements. For example, we have an international award program conferring on best 10 best teachers of the 11 Asian countries every 2 years. Second, the additional resources and the EEF education, the fund mechanism was set up in Thailand, which has worked targeting poor children and disadvantaged groups. It was neither easy nor fast. Retrospectively, the campaign for the legislation took us roughly 10 years. Credits are also given to our international friends that help us to win this legislation, the EEF legislations. For example, to name a few, we have Director Shigeru and Mr. Ichiro from UNESCO that are very helpful. Lars Sundergaard and Harry Petrinos from the World Bank also give us some kind of technical advice regarding the economics of education. The UNICEF, my old friend Arti, also very helpful. The Ministry of Education of Finland, Dr. Pasi Salzberg, also visited Thailand and gave insightful advice about the classroom improvement. The GPE, especially the former CEO, Alice Albright, who also gave us some inspiration about how we can set up a national GPE in Thailand. The GPE is global, so we just copy the GPE models into a domestic model for Thailand. The Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen also gave us some knowledge about how to manage the resources more effectively. This is just some names to mention, but there are some others, international friends who help us along the way, along the 10 years journeys to establish the EEF in Thailand. But even the EEF, we are far from perfection. We are just young and sometimes stupid. So we need to find some more effective strategies to improve our performance as well, to accomplish something with great impacts and sustainabilities. You cannot work alone. The broader your friend base is, the more knowledge, more instrumentations, more network support, and more likelihood of success you would attain. This is what my wife taught me some time ago. Further, I believe the EEA, or this alliance has a global aspirations, not just in Asia or in developing countries. Currently, the EEA has worked collaboratively with a total of 14 countries and 17 local and international organizations, including the non-government organizations, starting with developing knowledge sharing platform, like we are going to participate, like what we are going to participate today. But I see its promising potential, not only for just as a learning platform, but to effectively support countries and organizations to bring about greater outcomes, such as policy change or new legislations as we have had in Thailand. That's my personal hopes that this alliance will contribute more to the global changes in education reform. So next slide. I assume that after Thailand, the Secretariat role will pass on to another member organizations, probably in 1 or 2 years from now. And for those organizations of yours who are interested in joining this new EEA membership, for those of you who haven't joined us yet, I would like to invite you to look at our webpage, and if you are interested, you can apply to get the full memberships. I think my UNESCO friend will tell you more about how to proceed with the application, with the new application. Finally, I assume my UNESCO colleague will also share with you more about our upcoming activities. And today we will present to you 2 distinguished guest speakers from Australia and the VVOB, Vietnam. So our 2 guest speaker is probably ready to talk to you in a few minutes. I'm sure we will enjoy their inspirational and substantive case presentations. We also welcome any discussion. Please have a good time and productive participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome and inspiring message, as well as the brief information about the EEA and the session today. Now, let us hear the first presentation from our first honorable speakers, Ms. Kate Griffiths, Policy Director from the Australia Education Research Organisation, Sydney, Australia. And Ms. Griffiths has extensive experience in education policy and research translation. And her presentation topic today is Promoting the Science of Learning. May we welcome Ms. Griffiths on the virtual stage. The floor is yours, Kate.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Ms. Piyapa and Dr. Supakar. And thank you to EEA and UNESCO Bangkok for inviting me to speak here today. So as mentioned, my name is Kate Griffiths and I'm the Policy Director at AERO. And today I'll be talking about one of the foundational projects that we're working on at AERO, which is Promoting the Science of Learning, which is about evidence-based classroom practice. As I mentioned, this project is a foundation piece for AERO and underpins a lot of the work we're doing at AERO. And the reason for this is that we know if that we have evidence-based teaching practices in every school, in every classroom in Australia, then we can raise educational outcomes for all students. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm just going to start this presentation with a little bit of an overview of AERO, who we are and what we do, and then I'll move back to the project that I'm here to talk about today, Promoting the Science of Learning. So AERO is the Australian Education Research Organisation, and we're Australia's new independent education evidence body. We were only established or incorporated in April of 2021, so we are really very new. And we're established and funded by the Australian federal government as well as our state and territory governments. I should point out, though, that despite the fact that we are funded by government, we are actually governed by an independent board. And our board is comprised of 8 independent experts from different fields and includes current practitioners in schools, so teachers, leaders in schools, and others who have extensive experience in policy and social policy, business and early childhood education and care. I should point out that AERO's remit covers both early childhood education and care as well as schooling. And in the Australian case, it covers schooling to the end of schooling, which is to the end of year 12. So next slide, please. So what is AERO's vision? What does AERO exist to do? So AERO's vision is for excellence and equity in educational outcomes for all children and young people through effective use of evidence. And in support of this vision, we do three things. We generate high quality evidence. So that's where we might identify gaps in the existing education evidence base and think about the types of high quality research we could do to fill those gaps. But generating high quality evidence is certainly not all that we do or the main part of what we do. We also look to present high quality evidence that is relevant and accessible. So what does that mean? That means translating the evidence base or the research for our main stakeholders. So for practitioners, teachers and leaders in schools and educators in early childhood settings and policymakers as well. So we generate evidence, we translate evidence, and then the third component of what we do, which is really important to AERO's vision, is that we encourage the adoption and effective implementation of evidence in practice and policy. So that's about ensuring that evidence is actually embedded in practice. So not just generating it, not just translating it, but also embedding it in practice. Next slide, please. And as part of this vision, we have an annual research agenda. And on this research agenda for 2023, we have 7 priority areas. And these have been identified by considering demand, so the areas the education community nominate as the most pressing challenges, and impact, the areas the evidence base suggests would most improve excellence and equity in educational outcomes. So those 7 priority areas are literacy and numeracy, wellbeing of children and young people, continuity of learning and development across early childhood and schools, improving outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people, addressing educational disadvantage, supporting continuous school improvement, and examining evidence use in early childhood and schools. Next slide, please. So that's a little bit of a description of who AERO is and what we exist to do. And then I'll get back onto evidence-based classroom practice and our project around promoting the science of learning. So what's the challenge? Why is AERO undertaking this project? So in the Australian context, PISA shows that there are significant declines in both reading and mathematics achievement for Australian students over time. NAPLAN, which is Australia's national assessment program for students in years 3, 5, 7 and 9, NAPLAN doesn't show quite the same declines as PISA, but it does show a concerning number of students at or below national minimum standard. And it also shows that we have growing equity gaps in Australia. We know that teaching quality is one of the most important in-school factors in improving student achievement. I mean, we know obviously there are lots of factors that impact upon student achievement, but for this project and at AERO, we're focusing on those in-school factors and particularly focusing on teaching quality. And we also know that teachers need further support to understand how to teach for maximum impact to ensure that all students are learning. We know to a large extent what works. For example, cognitive science tells us how the brain learns and which teaching techniques are successful. For example, formative assessment or providing feedback to students. But implications for teaching are not always well understood or implemented in schools. For instance, AERO undertook a survey back in 2021 when we first set up of teachers and leaders in schools, in Australian schools, and we found that while many teachers reported that they often use effective teaching practices, which is great, 71% of teachers also reported using strategies which have not been proven to be effective for student learning in most or every lesson. Next slide, please. So this is the challenge for us in Australia, how to improve learning outcomes for all students, irrespective of their individual context. And so that's all students in every classroom, in every school in Australia. So this project is making the case for the science of learning. Cognitive science, and particularly cognitive load theory, have provided the science around how the brain learns and which teaching techniques will be successful based on how the brain learns and that science. For example, research evidence demonstrates that there are some practices that benefit all students. For example, sequencing learning, so students can access their prior knowledge to reduce cognitive load. Explicitly paced instruction with modelling and examples to help ease the burden on working memory. And classrooms that focus on routines for learning so students can develop positive dispositions for learning. So therefore, to summarise, this project aims to promote and support implementation of evidence-based teaching practices informed by the science of learning. Next slide, please. So what do we see as the opportunity here? We see that there are two opportunities here. There's one opportunity for practitioners and by practitioners, I mean teachers and leaders in schools, to build awareness and understanding of how students learn and implications for teaching practices. And then we think there's also an opportunity with policymakers. So to build on an existing interest amongst policymakers in Australia in how students learn and what the science says, and how to then embed evidence-based teaching practice in strategies and policies for schools and for teachers. So that's what we see as the opportunity. Next slide, please. So what have we done to date? So AERO has produced a series of what we're calling tried and tested guides, which outline what we know. So our tried and tested materials, and they're actually guides plus additional resources like case studies or implementation guides, they demonstrate evidence-based teaching practices that research tell us will really improve student learning. These practices are supported by a significant body of evidence that have been trialled in a variety of different contexts, and they're relevant to different subject areas and different year levels. Hence, we call them tried and tested. The tried and tested guides that we have so far are formative assessment, know where your students are in their learning, explicit instruction, know how to teach your students, mastery learning, know how to make sure your students learn, focus classrooms, managing the classroom to maximise learning, and spacing and retrieval practice, how to improve students' long-term retention of learning. Next slide, please. And you'll find these tried and tested guides, as well as a whole lot of other guides that we've produced specifically for teachers and leaders. And these guides are on other topics such as family engagement for learning or writing instruction. These are all found on AERO's, what we call our practice hub on our website, which brings together all these evidence-based practical resources in one location. It's organised by topic and will continue to grow with new resources being added on a regular basis. So that's what we've done so far in this project. But this project also has a long way to go. So what's next? Next slide, please. So AERO is aiming to produce comprehensive guidance on how students learn, evidence-based practices that align with this guidance, and supporting resources. So we'll develop an evidence-based model of teaching and learning, we might not call it that, but something along those lines, which will help teachers, leaders and systems, so policymakers, understand the practical implications for teaching, how evidence-based practices fit together as a whole, and how to apply these evidence-based practices for maximum impact on student outcomes. Next slide, please. An example of what some of this guidance might look like, and this is just an example at this stage because we haven't worked up, we haven't done all this work yet, but an example of guidance might be thinking about, for instance, how do students learn? How do students acquire new information? What do teachers need to do to ensure that students actually acquire that information? So teachers need to structure and sequence learning in small parts to prevent overloading working memory and to maximise retention. How do we ensure students retain what they learn? We can help to ensure, teachers can help to ensure that students retain what they learn by repeating, spacing out and varying opportunities to practice new information to ensure retention of new information. How do we ensure students draw on what they already know? Teachers need to routinely check for prior knowledge and understanding to help students connect new information with the most relevant prior knowledge and to prevent misconception. And how do we ensure students solve problems, for instance? Teachers can emphasise building on and consolidating existing knowledge to support students to solve problems rather than teaching generalised problem-solving skills. And that's about ensuring that students are actually taught content in which to solve problems with. They're not taught problem-solving skills outside that context. And next slide, please. So how will we be undertaking this project from here on in? We have sort of 5 different areas that we'll be focusing on. The first one is research and translation of the evidence base. We'll shortly be producing or publishing an evidence synthesis, which summarises the evidence base on how students learn most effectively based on cognitive science explanations of learning. We'll also be producing a teaching and learning model showing how these evidence-based practices fit together in the classroom. So in a lesson, how does a teacher ensure that all these practices are included in one lesson so that students have the optimal chance to learn. And we'll also be producing more practical resources like the tried and tested guides, implementation roadmaps, demonstration of practice, etc. So that's what we'll be doing in research and translation. In terms of engagement, we are conscious that engagement is always a two-way pipeline where we learn from each other. So we learn from our stakeholders and they learn from us to build a shared understanding and to build support for our work. We'll be working directly with teachers, so direct dissemination and support to teachers to support evidence-based practice in the classroom. And this will be including through AERO has something that we call a panel of educators, teachers and leaders. And they are teachers who have volunteered to help co-design and review our resources. So we'll be working closely with them. We'll also be working with policymakers and departments of education in Australia to inform their policies to ensure that they're evidence-based. And these policies might include their school improvement cycles, their professional learning and mentoring systems, and their compliance and regulation policies. And we'll also be engaging directly with experts, including researchers, to make sure that we're translating and understanding the research correctly. We'll also have an implementation approach. This will be what we're calling a small-scale implementation approach, where we identify some learning partners, and that's schools, to work with to implement evidence-based practice using an evidence-informed approach. We'll provide direct support and guidance to schools to change practice in the classroom, and we'll work to build credibility by working alongside teachers and schools to better understand their own enablers and barriers to implementing evidence-based practice. And we'll work to generate examples of successful implementation of evidence in schools. We'll also be monitoring and evaluating this project, both ongoing and real-time monitoring and evaluation through our implementation approach to learn what is working and what's not working. And we'll also be conducting an impact evaluation to see what difference we have made on learning outcomes. And we'll be monitoring and evaluating this work against AERO's own theory of change to ensure we're having a positive impact. And then finally, we'll be thinking about our communication strategy, considering our audiences and what messaging we need to use and when, and considering the best approaches for promoting this project to our different stakeholders, including what is the appropriate language to use and how we can be most inclusive in this approach. And next slide, please. So that's a summary of both AERO and the project, the work that we're doing around ensuring that there's evidence-based practice in the classroom by implementing science of learning or using the science of learning to understand how students learn and what approaches work in the classroom. If you'd like to know more about AERO, feel free to follow us on Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn. Or you can sign up to our newsletter, which provides regular updates on the work that AERO is doing, including this particular project that I've talked about today. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening to me, and thanks to AEEA for inviting me here today to speak about this project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. And thank you so much for sharing with us your good practices on evidence-based model for teaching and learning and the full implementation process for our educator to have like a clear view and be able to adapt your guidelines to maximize the learning outcome of the students. So we really appreciate your presentation very much. And we have learned a lot from your presentation. And thank you again. And for the second honorable speakers, we are very pleased to welcome Ms. Kelsey Carlton, Strategic Education Advisor, VVOB Education for Development based in Vietnam. Her presentation topic is Introduction of Process-Oriented Child Monitoring into Vietnamese Early Childcare Education. Kelsey, are you ready? I hope so. So the floor is over to you.
Yes, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you, Kate, for your presentation. I think what you were just speaking about evidence-based practices ties nicely into sort of what I'll be speaking about today. And so again, thank you so much to the EEA, EEF for inviting us to speak today. It's exciting to be here and to share this initiative that we've been doing in Vietnam with you all, as well as learn from the other speakers today. So thank you again. As mentioned, my name is Kelsey Carlton. I'm a Strategic Education Advisor with VVOB, specifically based with VVOB Vietnam. So today we'll be speaking about an initiative called Process-Oriented Child Monitoring. I'll be using the acronym POM throughout the presentation. Anytime you hear POM, we are referring to this, Process-Oriented Child Monitoring. It's a system of observation, reflection, and taking action in the classroom. So a bit of an overview. We're going to first present a little bit about who we are as VVOB, for those of you who might not be as familiar. The early childhood education system in Vietnam. What are the current successes and current challenges of the system? And then where does POM fit into this? Why was this initiative something that was needed within the system, and how has the implementation gone so far in Vietnam? Presenting a little bit about the impact research that we have previously conducted and the one that is ongoing, and then some time to discuss how we plan to move forward with this initiative. So who are we as VVOB? We are a nonprofit organization that has been around since 1982, specifically in Vietnam since 92, and only focus on the education system in Vietnam since 2008. We work in 8 partner countries, and our goal is capacity development for the government. So we focus on working directly within the system in order to have a more sustainable approach. So we collaborate with our government officials, with local authorities, at the provincial and district levels as well, in order to have a more sustainable program and to be more aware of the community needs and how it fits in with the existing policy and system. So our goal and our vision is creating a more quality education, because we believe that quality education is the foundation for development in this country. So we contribute to that by supporting the governments to be capacitated to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to quality education for every learner. So without any form of discrimination, and creating a more equitable system. So how we do this is we have multi-year programs where we engage the different levels of the system in capacity development. We try to have a diverse set of capacity development methods, whether it's training, peer learning, exposure visits, harvesting, and engage them in different levels in order to really make sure that the learning is happening on each level of the system. And then, like I mentioned, we try to engage the government as well throughout the program. So instead of us just delivering all the trainings, we support them side by side for them to be able to actually implement the programs themselves with our support. So we currently have 3 programs running in Vietnam in 9 different provinces. You can see some of the focuses below. We are both in the primary system and the early childhood education system currently in Vietnam, with a focus on equitable education, learning through play, child-centered approaches, and some more specific topics such as language and blended learning and school leadership. So today we're going to focus specifically on the ones that are highlighted, an initiative that we have been working on in the early childhood education system called POM, and how that contributes to a more equitable education system, specifically for the ethnic minority populations in Vietnam. So the early childhood education system in Vietnam has made pretty significant advances in the past 20 years on access to education. This has been done through a satellite school model in the country, where there were more schools that were placed in the rural regions to provide easier access for communities. So there has been a significant focus and significant advance in the enrollment rate, specifically for ethnic minority populations in Vietnam. However, now the task shifts to ensuring that all populations are receiving equitable opportunities in the system, as well as that teachers are equipped with skills to be able to support all students. So there's now a shift from access to quality, which is something that is seen globally in various regions. So that is the challenge of the system. Our goal, VVOB, is to support the government in giving preschool teachers those competencies that they need in order to improve the quality of education for all preschool children. So helping them recognize which students may be struggling more than others, why they're struggling, and what the teacher can do in order to provide a more equitable learning environment for those students. So the question before we start discussing exactly what POM is, are all children in the class learning? Thinking back to that challenge just presented, this was a question that VVOB sat with, that we sat with our government partners with, looked at the research and the data to answer Do we think all children in the classroom are learning? And from research that we conducted, as well as an acknowledgement from the government in several documents, it is not the case that all children are learning at the same rate. So there are inequities between the students that speak only Vietnamese at home and those students who may speak an ethnic minority language or multilingual backgrounds in the classroom. So then the question became why? Why aren't all children not learning, and what can be done about it? This is where POM was introduced to be able to help answer some of those questions. Typically in the early childhood system in Vietnam, which we'll get into a little bit more in a bit, there's a one-size-fits-all type of model, which is very common in a lot of situations. And teachers are taught one method to use, that's the one they use, and hoping that all students are able to be successful with that methodology. We know that that's not always the case. So helping teachers recognize that their one size will fit some students and not others. So asking yourself, are all children learning, then leads the question to what is learning? And you can see the picture on the left. This is a very common picture to see, not only in Vietnam, but in other areas of the world as well, very focused on the product, right? They're all the exact same almost. Does that mean the child was learning? Maybe yes, maybe no. It depends on what the objectives were of that lesson. Looking at the picture on the right, is that learning? Again, maybe yes, maybe no. It always depends. But having those conversations with the government here and with our partners to say, what do we qualify as active learning? What do we qualify as deep level learning? And opening up those conversations was the first step when we were initiating this initiative of POM. The other aspect here is that there has been a focus in Vietnam on switching to a child-centered approach. This is very prevalent in the early childhood education policies here in Vietnam and around the world, but there isn't necessarily clear guidance on what does that look like? What does a child-centered approach mean, and how can the teacher actively promote a child-centered approach? So to answer those questions and relate to the challenge at the beginning, we worked with an initiative called process-oriented child monitoring. Simply put, it's answering those questions by providing an intentional and focused child observation. These observations are focused on two concepts: the concept of well-being in the classroom and the concept of involvement, with the assumption and some research now proving that well-being and involvement, the higher the levels, the deeper level learning that the child has, therefore increasing their holistic development levels as well. So POM focuses on identifying the learning barriers, observing children, figuring out, do they have high levels of well-being and involvement? If not, why? And what actions can the teacher take in order to increase those levels? So as an early childhood educator, it might seem a bit obvious that you should focus on the well-being and involvement of a child, but what we've seen is that teachers don't necessarily know what do those terms mean for them in the classroom? What does true high involvement look like? What does well-being look like in the classroom? And what can they do about it? How can they increase those levels within what's in their control? Like Kate mentioned, there's a lot that happens outside of the classroom that we might not be in control over, but helping the teacher focus on what is in their sphere of control and using these evidence-based practices to support them. So this is the reflective cycle of POM. POM is based on an idea of reflective teaching. It's a very simple process, but deep. So you start with observing the child's well-being and involvement in the classroom, reflecting on what could the potential barriers to learning and participation be, and then acting. So there's a key point here of not only reflecting and recognizing, okay, this child is really struggling socializing in the classroom, or they're not engaged, but then taking the step to identify why and acting on it. And then you can see, because it's a cycle, after acting, observing again. Did that change that I make as a teacher actually have an impact on the student? Did it increase their levels of well-being and involvement or not? And then starting over the cycle again. So the cycle and this idea of reflective teaching practice is actually something quite new in the Vietnamese system. Again, going beyond that one-size-fits-all model and assuming that that model will work for all children, but really being reflective on your teaching practices to say, is what I'm doing in the classroom working for all students? And if not, how can I adjust on the spot to be able to support the students. So before the teacher is able to actually observe, notice the levels of well-being and involvement, one of the key parts that we had to go through with our teachers and government partners was defining what is well-being and what is involvement. So a lot of times when we speak about well-being, people assume well-behaved, obedient. The child is well-behaved in the classroom. Well-being is not actually defined this way, nor is it defined this way in POM. We think of it more of the child's emotional state in the classroom. Again, this does not mean that they are not necessarily, that they're always exhibiting positive emotions. The child can experience negative emotions and still have a high well-being in the classroom. We as adults go through our highs and lows with emotions as well, the children in the classroom as well. So a negative emotion here and there, as the child is learning to navigate their emotional capacity and responses, is something that is, of course, there's something they're working through at that age. So a high level of well-being is an enjoyment in the classroom. The child feels confident to take risks. The child feels excited. The child has self-confidence, self-esteem, and they're flexible, and they're able to enjoy their classroom. The next key component is involvement. Involvement, and not necessarily the general idea of, is the child doing the work? Is the child seated and tracing the letters? That's not how we're defining involvement in POM. In POM, involvement is deep concentration or high mental activity, mental stimulation. Is the child satisfied with their work? Are they proud of what they've done? Did they maintain their focus for a long period of time, therefore showing us that there was a deep concentration in the child? All of that showing that they're operating within the limits of the zone of proximal development. So that is how involvement is defined when we speak about involvement in POM. So these two aspects put together, we believe, develops a deep level of learning. And we'll speak in the research a little bit about what we saw later when we focused on these two aspects. The big component here when we focus on well-being and involvement is, like I mentioned earlier, we're not focused on the product necessarily. We're not focused on all the children producing the exact same artwork or exact same answer to the problem, but we're looking at process variables that are measuring the quality of the education in the classroom and the quality of the learning. Another benefit of POM is that it's providing teachers immediate feedback and they can immediately adapt their approach. POM is also relevant for every developmental domain, so it is not a tool that they can only measure well-being and involvement in one content area, or it is only applicable for social emotional learning. We can see that it has impact and across multiple developmental areas and can be utilized during any content area in early childhood as well. So how does the teacher do this? Once they understand the concepts of well-being and involvement, then there's a scale. There's a scale for well-being and a scale for involvement. We know these are quite subjective, and they are terms, they're soft skills that are very difficult to measure. One teacher might measure a student on one level and one on another. And there's also an acknowledgement that a child's well-being and involvement can change very quickly by the day, by the hour. As teachers become more competent using this tool, they are then able to have a panorama of what this child's general state of well-being and involvement is in the classroom. Instead of just looking at one snapshot in time, when they measure over the course of days, weeks, and months, they're able to see a general picture of this child. The benefit of the scales as well is that it helps the teacher track the child's progress over time. So as the teacher is making those changes in the classroom, they're able to see, is it having an impact or not, and adjusting their teaching practices based on that evidence or based on that information that they've received. Instead of just trying new approaches all the time and not knowing which one's working and which one's not, POM allows the teacher to actually see what levels of well-being and involvement have been increasing or not. Also, once you have all of your children in your classroom's data in the system, you can see, are there groups of children that may be experiencing low level of well-being and they may have similar challenges. So can you support groups of students that way as well? So now that they have gone through step one of observing, the next part is reflecting on the barriers. noticing if children have low levels of well-being and involvement, and asking yourself why. So some of the possible barriers that we have seen are language barriers for the children. We're speaking about with the ethnic minority students in Vietnam, if they have not been exposed to Vietnamese, and that could create a barrier both in well-being and involvement. Some of the other ones you can see listed below as well: gender, contextualization, the interests of the children, and then an activity being too easy or too hard for the student as well can affect both their well-being and involvement. So the teacher identifies the barrier, and then they go to the last step, which is acting. Then they need to choose an action step in order to address one of those barriers. And there might be multiple happening at one time. We encourage teachers to zoom in on one of them, try to narrow it down, focus on one barrier first, take an action step, and see if it works. So within the PALM materials, we have given 8 action points as suggestions. These are by no means an exhaustive list, and some of them are quite broad with the intention that the teacher knows their classroom the best, and based on that specific learning barrier that they found, they can then adapt one of these action points to what the child needs. And this is a jumping point to get teachers into this habit of observing, reflecting, and acting. And as they become more proficient, they can expand on these action points, make them more specific, make them more contextualized for their classroom. In the PALM materials, there also are more specific. There's some examples. For example, the rearranged classroom, there's photos of exactly how you could do it, why you should do it in certain ways versus others, what benefits there are. So there are more details in the materials that we will be sharing with you all as well. The idea is that we hope that through this 3-step cycle that we're creating more reflective teachers. We're creating a teacher mindset that they need to reflect on their own practices. How are their lessons? How are even their interactions with the children, the interactions between the children, all impacting the learning of the child? Moving beyond just focusing on the academics and the product, but what's happening during the process. So moving forward a little bit about how this has been integrated within the system and where we are in the process of using PALM in Vietnam is it was originally developed in Belgium. It was then piloted and adapted with VVOB and our government partners between 2015 and 16. And then we introduced it into one of our 5-year programs. During that program, we conducted our first impact research, which we'll share the results on shortly. Following that, we were pleased to receive the endorsement from the Ministry of Education, and now we're using it as a foundation for our further programs and trying to expand that evidence base. So like Kate was saying, the need for these evidence-based practices, we have initial evidence for it, but we see the need to increase that as well, increase the scale of our research as well as the locations to try it in different contexts as well. So how has it fit within the system? One of the reasons that we believe it's been successful so far in Vietnam is that it's capitalizing on a task that already exists. So within the Vietnam early childhood education system, teachers are required to do daily observations of children. After speaking to a lot of teachers and school leaders, we realized that these observations weren't actually being capitalized on. So the teachers were doing the observation, but as far as changes in practice, in behavior, and approach, there was no outcome from them. So PALM provides them a way to do the task that's already being asked of them, but in a systematic and intentional way, and giving them an actual result and something that they can use moving forward to improve their practices. So this way, the teacher did not see PALM coming into the system as an additional, another task on top of the million things that the ECE teachers are working on, but a way to do part of their job that they're already required to do in a better and more intentional way. Again, also being aligned with the ECE curriculum and the child-centered approach, the action points are based on this idea that we are centering our approaches on the child. So it fits nicely within the current policies, making it easier to blend in with the current system. And then the government has here in Vietnam expressed a priority on the ethnic minority populations, and this is another way in order to support that. So not only mentioning it as a priority, but how can we actually put that into practice? So a few things on the system of how it's been integrated. The materials were endorsed, and some of the provinces have been integrating this into their school year tasks, which shows us that there's a great interest in it. And then we're working for some blended modalities. So an e-course on Moodle was developed, And then we're ongoing testing a POM app to see about its relevance and need within the system as well. So there's 2 impact researches with POM, one that was concluded in 2021. The results you can see on the slides and presented here. We saw statistically significant improvements in the overall scores. EAP, which is listed here, is the East Asia Pacific Early Childhood Development Scales. There was an overall increase in their scores, and then in the 3 topics listed above as well. So we can see that there are some changes in social emotional development and health behaviors and overall scores of children. Our new impact research, like I said, it's important for us to expand this research base and expand our evidence base of POM. We conducted baseline last year and have seen that in the new provinces that we would be working in, the ethnic minority students are still performing significantly lower across 6 of the 7 domain areas using those scales. That tells us that although this has been a government priority, the child-centered approach and focus on ethnic minority populations, that it has not yet had an impact in certain areas. So we will be implementing POM alongside a language program in these provinces, and in 2025, conducting our inline to be able to see has this been effective and in what areas. So these are our 3 steps moving forward: increasing the evidence base, as I just explained, using it as a foundation for our program, and continuing to scale it nationwide and being able to share this practice with other people in the region and beyond, and to hear how it could be implemented into other contexts. So we are happy to share the materials. The QR code is there. I believe the presentation will be also shared with everyone afterwards. Feel free to ask any questions, and it's been a pleasure to share POM with you all today, and look forward to hearing the rest of the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelsey, for the interesting presentation. We have learned the importance for the improving the well-being and in the involvement of the young children in the classroom, and action points to improve the learning environment for the early child education. And we learned that if young people are happy, they will involve more and they will learn better. Is that right?
Yes, exactly.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. And may I move on the next part of the session on the Q&A. And we have about 20 minutes for this, for addressing the inquiry from our participants. All right, okay. The first question, let me go through a little bit. What were the challenges that you are faced in implementing best practice in your country? What were the local contexts that you had to take into consideration? So this question will address both of you. And for the next question is addressing to Kate. I would like to ask AERO on what are your recommendations for school when collecting monitoring data with field resources? What data should be collected first? And for the third question, we'll be addressing to Kelsey. What are some cases that you have come across of the local teachers trying to adapt POM in their classroom? Where there are new activities that were realized? Okay, I think that long questions. Okay, for the last question, I think that it will be addressed to Kate, all right? From your experience, how can we persuade the government to integrate evidence-based practice in the education system? So, how are we gonna do for the questions? So, may I invite Kate first? Okay, and what question you want to address? Maybe you can address the question, as the whole answer to the inquiries from the participants.
Yes, absolutely. I'm happy to start with question 1, if that works. The challenges that you face in implementing best practice in your country, and what were the local contexts that you had to take into consideration. I think in Australia, we have a few different contextual considerations that we have to take into account. Education in Australia is, in terms of policy, there are each state and territory in Australia has its own Department of Education, and then there is also a federal Department of Education. So what this can lead to is sometimes mixed messaging and different information coming down to teachers from different places. We also know that the teachers aren't there, from surveys that AERO has undertaken, teachers aren't necessarily aware of how to find evidence-based practice and then how to use evidence-based practice. It's not through a lack of willingness, it's through a lack of different information, a whole lot of different information being thrown at teachers from different sources. So what AERO is trying to do in this space is try to unpack the evidence base for teachers in a way that is really accessible. And we're thinking about our stakeholders as two main stakeholders, both teachers and practitioners and educators. So how we interact directly with teachers and educators on the ground, but then also how we influence policy and how we work with policymakers to ensure that evidence-based policy is coming down to schools and it is consistent and there's consistent messaging and it's based on the evidence base. So that's question one. I'm not sure if I should now leave Kelsey to answer.
All right, maybe Kelsey, would you mind to add for the question one, please?
Yes, so one of the challenges that we had with PALM is that as soon as you introduce a scale which has numbers, it becomes an evaluation tool, which it is never meant to be something to evaluate students or teachers in the traditional sense of evaluation. It is not to mark whether the students are performing highly or the teachers are performing highly. It is truly meant to be a reflective tool. So that definitely is a challenge working within a system that does highly value evaluations and standardized assessments. Being able to introduce a tool in this way that does have a numerical value, but helping teachers realize it's just for them. It's just for them to reflect on their practice, and more so helping school leaders and government officials not use this tool in order to evaluate teachers as well. So that has been something that we've had to be extremely clear with when working with our partners of what is the purpose of these scores. And it is not necessarily to be a standardized evaluation of students in any academic sense, but meant to be a reflective tool for teacher practice. So that's been one of the challenges that we've had in the system and how we've tried to address it.
That's great. Thank you so much for the very clear answer. And for the second question, Kate, would you like to go through for the recommendations to the school when collecting the monitoring data with field resources?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I can speak to this in terms of what classroom teachers themselves can do to collect data about their students. So all classroom teachers can and should have formative assessment practices in place where they're constantly collecting data on their students. And this would be alongside summative assessment practices. So when I'm talking about formative assessment practices, I'm talking about things like little exit quizzes at the end of lessons, questioning, making sure that all students have a chance to answer questions, etc., to keep track of where your individual students are at, so that you know where to pitch, so that teachers understand where to pitch each lesson to. In terms of sort of data more broadly than this, this is a little bit harder for me to answer. I guess I can talk about in the Australian context. We also encourage teachers and schools to make use of other data sources that are available to them. Our state government departments often run surveys on, for instance, wellbeing surveys, for instance, and that data is always available to schools. And we encourage schools to, the school leadership team, to look at that data and unpack that data and think about what that means, both at the school level and at the classroom level.
Thank you so much. I think that the second question also the challenges for the Southeast Asian school as well. And for the third question for Kelsey, what are some cases that you have come across of the local teachers trying to adapt POM in their classroom? And are there new initiative for them?
There's two ways that we've seen specifically our local teachers adapting POM into their current system, as well as the activities specifically in the classroom. So one thing that we've seen is that second step of the cycle where they're reflecting on the barriers, identifying them, that can be really difficult. especially when they're first beginning. Maybe you notice that a student isn't involved, but it's difficult to understand why and really get to the root of it. And so one way that the teachers have adapted PALM in order to be able to support them in that second step is by bringing it to their professional teacher meetings. So professional teacher meetings are part of the system here where teachers are together to collaborate on a variety of topics, professional development. And so using PALM and being able to bring in that data that each of the teachers have seen in their classroom and collaborate together. Are they seeing any commonalities? Does another teacher have a different idea? So kind of a knock-on benefit of PALM has been that it has increased the collaboration between the teachers in that respect as well. So that's one way they adapted it both to fit into their current professional development system, as well as that second step that they find that they can find difficult, being able to use each other to support it. As far as new activities that were realized, the 8 action steps, like I mentioned, are really broad. So we've seen that the teachers have been able to make those more concrete. For example, when it talks about looking at the children's interests and identifying barriers, that one of the barriers could be gender in the classroom and how that's affecting the relationships between the teacher and the students amongst themselves. One thing that we've seen is that the teachers have encouraged students to be in different learning corners and different activities that are not gender specific. So previously in a lot of classrooms, teachers would encourage certain students to go to the construction corner, for example, and certain students to maybe the market corner or the dress up corner, depending on their gender. So then once reflecting with PALM, the teachers have been able to identify that as one of the barriers to involvement and to well-being and encourage the students to explore different corners regardless of their gender. And so that's one way that we've seen them kind of make those activities more specific.
So much, very comprehensive answer. All right, for the next question, number 4, I think that it could be addressed both of you. But however, I would like to ask you only 2 key suggestions that you can think that how can we persuade the government to integrate evidence-based practices into the education system? All right, anything that from the top of your head right now, 2 things. Is it too difficult? Or maybe one thing that you can think about?
I think very quickly we can say from AERO's experience that we try to use both a top-down and a bottom-up approach. So working directly with teachers and practitioners and leaders in schools to integrate evidence-based practices, as well as working with governments to persuade and influence and support government policymakers to integrate evidence-based practices into the education system. And I think this is an approach that obviously is not unique to Australia and can work equally well in Southeast Asia or anywhere else in the world.
How about Kelsey? Do you have any other suggestions?
Yeah, I would say the 2 that we focus most on persuading the government is we try to make the evidence that we're presenting easy to understand and relatable. So instead of presenting the impact research in a way that might be easy to zone out when you're listening to it, presenting it in really concrete bite-sized pieces and making it applicable to their work exactly. The other aspect is bringing government practitioners in to see the evidence-based practices in the classroom. So exposure visits, supporting their reflection after seeing the evidence in the classroom. So having that firsthand experience as well.
That's very good suggestions. And the last question, I think that addressed to the Kelsey. And what is the role mother tongue of the language minorities in the POM in Vietnam, and how you engage with the Vietnam Ministry of Education?
Yeah, it's a great question. The benefit of PALM is that it is applicable across any of the ethnic minority languages. So while the tool is available in English, in Vietnamese and in English, it is only focusing on the child's well-being and involvement, not necessarily measuring their language skills. So when you go through the materials, you can see the things that the teacher needs to be looking for, and most of them are nonverbal. So the teacher is able to measure these skills without necessarily speaking the ethnic minority language of the child if they're unable to. Of course, if they're able to, they're receiving more information as well. And then for how do we engage with the Ministry of Education, they were involved in the initial stages in the piloting, as far as piloting it, as well as adapting it to the context, seeing it is a fit within the system and within the policies. So from the beginning, they were involved with us in that adaptation and then have been involved throughout. We have a group of experts, national experts, both from university education colleges here in Vietnam, as well as representatives from the Ministry of Education who participate in the delivery of the PALM trainings. They're involved in all levels of the implementation.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelsey. How about Kate? Would you like to add something that, that is come up from your head right now? You want to
No, I'm not sure. I'd just actually like to reiterate a point that Kelsey made before about how we persuade government and how we persuade our stakeholders, and very much that it is about, yes, talking in language that resonates, talking in frameworks that resonates, and in a way that is simple and easy to access. I just want to reiterate that point because I think that is one of the really critical points about how we persuade our stakeholders to integrate evidence-based practice.
Right, that's great. I think that we have covered all the important questions from our participants, and I would like to thank our participants for sending us the very challenging questions to our speakers. And it is very fruitful session and very comprehensive, very informative that I learned a lot from the speakers today. And thank you so much for your presentation and your knowledge, your sharing expertise, and to make this session lively. Thank you so much. So now we are reaching to the end of the session, and I would like to invite again Dr. Supakon Borsai for the closing message. Dr. Supakon, the floor is over to you.
Unfortunately, we have too short time for both presentations. And actually, I have been a fan of the two countries. Vietnam has made very admirable progress in terms of education and early childhood. Probably often is overlooked by many people. Even in Thailand, we don't have any government agency that is directly responsible for these very important groups. So that's why Dr. Grayot, my CEO, is going to invite international collaborations further, something like that. And also Australia, I have been a big fan of Australia. In fact, my previous organizations, the Thai Health Promotion Foundation, was imported from Victoria. And I have my old friend Rhonda Cabelli, who is still there and has been my lifetime teachers and friends for so long. So I would like to thank both speakers who have shared amazing and significant practices to these groups, and we hope to have you more in the futures. They are good outline. What you have presented are quite good outline and thinking. I can talk with each of you at least half a day further. And you are quite not very far from Thailand. Maybe you can come to Thailand sometimes. We establish an internal research. I can call it department within the Equitable Education Foundations. So maybe you can stay with us for a few weeks or a few months if you like sometime. So thank you once again for the two wonderful presentations. Thank you.
And to end the session, I invite Ms. Sovilin for the closing.
Thank you very much, Ms. Piyapa and Dr. Supakon, for your kind message and the remarks. So on behalf of UNESCO Bangkok and the EEA Secretariat, I would like to once again inform you of the Equitable Education Hub website, or known as Equity Ed Hub, which was launched last year. So this website is an open knowledge sharing hub containing various resources related to equity in education. So you can learn more about the EEA Alliance and join the Alliance through this website. So please also subscribe to our newsletter on the website, and you don't miss out our new coming activities and events. For example, The online course with 10 modules on equitable education that the EEA members, as well as UNESCO Bangkok and UNICEF and the Equitable Education Hub will be released in the coming months and will be freely open for everyone to take the course. So also please stay tuned for the upcoming EEA webinar series, which will be held throughout this year to cover various topics in improving equity in education, from budgeting and financing mechanisms, legal framework, policy development, and M&E. And lastly, I would like to thank you all once again for your attention, and special thanks to our speakers, moderators, EEF colleagues, EEA members, organizations, and my team at UNESCO Bangkok for making this webinar possible. And we look forward to welcoming you all at the next webinar. Thank you.